Okay, here we are with the third and final recording for the New Deal topic. I hope everybody out there is doing really well. Make sure you let me know anytime you've got questions about any of the content or assignments or anything like that, so that I can give you some guidance and feedback. Make sure you're looking at the full PowerPoints on Blackboard as well, because they're going to have material that's going to be essential for you for exams and assignments and all that kind of stuff as well. So in our previous two sessions for the New Deal, we talked about the background for it, where it came from, how Roosevelt sort of approached it conceptually. Also then talked a little bit about some of the legislation that comes out of the New Deal itself. Things like the TVA, the Works Progress Administration, Social Security, and that sort of thing. So in this session, what we're going to look at is more describing some of the criticisms of the New Deal, some of the individual figures who sort of became relatively significant in opposition to Roosevelt and or in opposition to New Deal policies. And then talk about what kinds of things ended up slowing down the New Deal and how it essentially ended by the late 1930s into the early 1940s. So first thing we'll look at is some of the critics of the New Deal, and they came from a variety of different angles. Some of them were more targeted, more specific, in the sense that they had particular things that either they wanted to see implemented or particular kinds of criticisms of Roosevelt and or New Deal policies. One of the people who had a very targeted and very particular kind of concern was a man named Francis Townsend. Francis Townsend was a medical doctor, and Townsend built a fairly wide following by focusing the issue of what he called an old age pension. There is some speculation that Townsend's critiques and criticisms may have contributed to Roosevelt and the passage of the Social Security Act, but really it looks pretty clear that Roosevelt had a plan for some sort of senior pension before Townsend even got started. Townsend may have forced Roosevelt's hand in terms of speeding up the process of Roosevelt delivering that legislation to Congress. Doesn't look as though Roosevelt created Social Security in order to sort of pacify Townsend and his followers. But Townsend's plan was to give anybody 60 and over $200 every month. And this would be paid for with a national sales tax of 2%. The only requirement for that $200 would be that the individual was required to spend that $200 within 30 days in order to be able to receive the next payment, which is extremely difficult to oversee. And to make sure that this is actually happening, to kind of police this requirement. But the idea of this plan was sort of twofold. For one, it would give senior citizens money that they could use for food, for rent, for utilities, for medicine, whatever the case may be, while at the same time, the requirement that they spend the $200 every 30 days would, for one, help to power the 2% national sales tax that would be feeding this pension system, because every time somebody went out to spend part of that $200, the thing that they bought would be subject to the 2% sales tax that would end up going to help pay for the program itself. In addition, the idea was that that $200 spend would contribute to sort of an uptick in manufacturing, an uptick in production, because all of these seniors going out spending their $200 means that they would be buying things that would then hopefully compel businesses to put people back on the assembly lines, put people back to work manufacturing or providing services or whatever the case may be. So Townsend's plan, of course, never goes into effect. Whether it connects to Social Security and Roosevelt's existing or eventual ideas about developing an old age pension, really hard to say with absolute certainty. But Townsend definitely becomes a fairly significant and outspoken critic of Roosevelt in the process of him sort of stumping for this plan. Another figure who becomes one of the notable critics of Roosevelt and the New Deal is a former Catholic priest named Charles Coughlin. And Coughlin says initially that he's very supportive of the New Deal. He likes the idea of Roosevelt and New Deal programs that are especially the ones targeted towards limiting the power or the capacities of the national sort of financial system, so banks, brokerage houses, that kind of thing. And he is very concerned with what he calls the money changers, right? He's using a reference to the New Testament stories of Jesus cleansing the temple of the money changers. And Coughlin is sort of making the case that big business has too much power in the American economy. Initially, he's praising Roosevelt for trying to limit that power. Over time, Coughlin kind of goes off the rails a little bit and begins to challenge Roosevelt. Not to say that that's why he goes off the rails, he just becomes very sort of xenophobic, very nationalistic. He starts to sprinkle more and more anti-Semitism into his weekly radio broadcasts. Initially, at its peak, he has access to the CBS National Radio Network, which is coast to coast, north to south, east to west. And on a weekly basis, he reaches up to 40 million listeners. Over time, though, he begins to lose a lot of that because he gets defrocked by the Catholic Church. He starts this organization called the National Union of Social Justice, which he's hoping will become kind of a lobby group to advance a very particular agenda of anti-Semitism, xenophobia, isolationist kinds of policy. And so while he starts out as being somebody who is a fairly significant figure in the world of sort of political commentary and social commentary in the 1930s, he really sort of squanders that fairly quickly. The other figure who is potentially even more of a direct threat politically to Roosevelt is a guy from Louisiana who had served as senator and governor from the state named Huey Long. And Huey Long is what we would call a demagogue, right? He is somebody that is very outspoken about national issues, makes totally unrealistic and unreasonable kinds of promises, typically resorts to very blunt kinds of emotional appeals in order to build a following, makes a lot of references to things like, well, you know that so-and-so or this particular group is the reason that your life isn't perfect right now. If you elect me into positions of authority, I will make sure that that particular group or population is dealt with. I'll make sure that that particular issue is sort of gotten rid of to free up life for you, right? I'll make your life better by eliminating the things that you believe are responsible for your life not being great right now. So he says things that people want to hear. As a result, he gets a very big following, not just in Louisiana, but nationwide, especially among the lower classes, partially because he trots out this kind of absurd plan called the Share Our Wealth Plan. Basically what this would be would be sort of an annual paycheck, an annual subsidy for every household in the country. And even though he doesn't really explain how it would work, he promises that he would give every single family in the country of a certain socioeconomic status a $5,000 initial payout and then $2,500 every year thereafter. He doesn't say where this money will come from, other than the fact that he promises that he will take it from the rich, excuse me, and give it to the poor. Naturally, the less critical people in the country really gravitate towards this. Certainly people who are more rational look at that and say, that doesn't make any sense. I don't know how you could possibly achieve that, especially since he doesn't provide any details or specifics. But naturally, he starts to build a pretty good following from that. Historians still speculate if he had not been assassinated in September of 1935, historians still speculate whether or not Huey Long would have been a legitimate challenger to Roosevelt in the election of 1936. It's really hard to say. There's no way, you know, as much as we like to kind of play around with hypothetical questions and what ifs, there's really no way you can actually answer them with any kind of certainty or guarantee. Huey Long, who I was just talking about, is the man on the right. That's during one of his political rallies. I think it's when he was governor of Louisiana. The man on the left then is Father Coughlin, Father Charles Coughlin. Both of them, as I said, become fairly outspoken figures in the ranks of sort of outsiders criticizing Roosevelt. Neither one of them manages to do a lot to upend Roosevelt's presidency. Certainly, they don't have any luck in influencing Roosevelt's re-election attempts in 1936. And you can see the map here. If you remember the map from the beginning of the lecture sessions for the New Deal, there was a lot of blue that Roosevelt carried when he was running against Herbert Hoover. In 1936, he's running against the governor of Kansas, a Republican named Alf Landon. And as massive a landslide as Roosevelt wins in 1932, he even beats that in 1936. And you can see he wins all but 8 electoral votes. And if I remember right, only Reagan comes close to this. Reagan might actually even have a bigger win in either 80 or 84. Certainly it's right up there. And you can see that Roosevelt has managed to carry North, South, East, West, New England, Midwest, Mountain States, Deep South, right, everything. He's built a coalition of minority voters, right, African Americans in particular, the urban populations of major cities throughout the country, a big labor component of his support, the farm community, practically every cross-section that you can think of the American public ends up being part of what's known as the New Deal coalition, right? This sort of massive voter bloc that Democrats really sort of play to through Roosevelt's time and then into the 1950s with Truman. Certainly there are going to be negatives to this, though, because believe it or not, Roosevelt may actually have won too great a victory in some respects, because he sees the victory in 1936 as evidence of massive popular support, which it can certainly be interpreted that way. But he also expects that this gives him a lot of political capital to work with. In other words, if you can imagine political capital as the equivalent of sort of spending money that a politician can use to buy passage of certain bills or to advance certain ideas, Roosevelt believes that his bank account is filled with a lot of political power that he can spend however he wants. And he decides that he's going to go after the Supreme Court. So the court in 1935 had abolished several New Deal programs, including the NRA with the Schechter versus the U.S. case that we talked about earlier. And Roosevelt believes that the Supreme Court is the biggest obstacle to him getting all of the different kinds of policies and programs that he wants. And so he presents Congress with this law, this potential law, that will allow him to select additional Supreme Court justices for every sitting justice over the age of 70 and a half who would refuse to retire. In other words, you would look at the makeup of the court, of the 9 people on the court, and every person that's on the Supreme Court in 1937 who is more than 70 and a half would give Roosevelt an additional selection for the court. And if this bill had passed, he would have been able to select up to 6 new justices. So this would have made the number of justices on the Supreme Court 15. And from Roosevelt's perspective, this would have guaranteed that he would be able to basically pack the Supreme Court with people that would vote in favor of his policies. There is no constitutional specification for the size of the Supreme Court. At various times, it has been various numbers. It's more commonly, and right now, it's 9. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says that it has to be 9. So Roosevelt, from that standpoint, had every right to propose this kind of legislation. However, it ends up being a very poor decision for him, politically speaking. Conservatives, Republicans in Congress, were beginning to look for ways that they could easily resist Roosevelt and kind of slow down the momentum of the New Deal. They were already doing that by 1936. Even though Roosevelt wins a massive landslide, he is certainly the face of the Democratic Party, but there are Democrats who are running at other levels who don't necessarily have the same success as Roosevelt does. And so this gives Republicans, not just in Congress, but elsewhere, the opportunity to sort of emphasize the perception that Roosevelt is on the way to becoming a dictator, right? That he is reorganizing the government to suit his own needs. He is planning on packing the Supreme Court so that his plan will not be slowed down or destroyed by court review, judicial review. And so he loses a lot of face as a result of the court packing scheme, right? The Judiciary Reorganization Bill. The bill fails in committee. It never even makes it to a vote in Congress, where it would have failed there almost certainly too. Because even though Democrats in Congress wanted to support Roosevelt and support the New Deal, they certainly recognized that they also had to balance their own constituencies and balance their need to work in an increasingly bipartisan way with Republicans in Congress as well. The sort of irony of this is that shortly after the Judiciary Reorganization Bill fails, Roosevelt still ends up being able to appoint 5 new justices because a number of the justices on the court do actually retire, giving Roosevelt that opportunity even without the passage of this court packing idea. As things start to move towards the late 1930s then, there are fewer and fewer New Deal programs. partially due to the kind of lost prestige and lost momentum that Roosevelt suffers because of the court packing scheme, partially because the New Deal systems that had already been implemented, their impact is starting to filter through the economy, and so there are some periods of improvement, partially because Republicans are gaining a certain amount of influence and power in Congress, and so they are putting up roadblocks whenever they can to some of these New Deal programs. And partially the reason that things are starting to slow down is because things elsewhere in the world are beginning to get more important, specifically things happening in Europe and Japan. This is going to lead us then directly into our next topic, which is going to be World War II, because economically speaking, the United States is beginning to recover because of sort of ramping up production to help supply some of the countries that are at war. Because keep in mind, the war begins and preparations for the war begin before the United States is actually involved. So the US begins, in some respects, expanding production to meet the orders from places like Britain or France. In other cases, US manufacturing is gearing up partially to help meet the demands of the US government for preparation for the war. So there's less of the sort of economic impact of unemployment and lack of spending power and that kind of thing as more people are going to work to help build the economy's response to those demands for the war. And then domestically and legislatively, Roosevelt's attention really starts to shift away and focus more on what's happening in Europe and in Asia. And so those things all together mean that there's not as much impetus or impulse to continue New Deal programs because of the competing concerns of other, in some ways, kind of more prominent, more significant kinds of issues. So World War II is going to be the next thing that we will get into. That'll be our next session. It's going to be a fairly big one, as you can imagine. There's a lot to try to cover with that. It's a very, very important moment in American history, world history. Lots of the consequences of the Second World War still are kind of seeping through the world today. And so we'll talk about some of that, and we'll talk about the way the war points directly towards things like the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and things like that. So that is it for this session, for this topic. Let me know if you've got questions about anything. I'll be glad to help out with that. In the meantime, be reviewing the full PowerPoints on Blackboard, and I will see everybody next time when we get into the Second World War.